Okay, so the first subject we are going to be covering is the Gilded Age. So with the Gilded Age, we have to think back of what you last learned in U.S. history in 8th grade, and we ended in 8th grade with the Civil War. So with the Civil War ending, we had to figure out what we were going to do with the new people that were in our country that weren't already citizens. So that's where the Reconstruction Amendments come in. So the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. 14th Amendment granted African Americans their citizenship and provided equal protection under the law to all people. And the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. Please note, it is Black men. Women won't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment, and that is all women. So at this point, just men are able to vote. So easy way to remember this is free citizens vote, 13, 14, 15. So with segregation being a huge issue, especially in the South, we have the first court case of Plessy v. Ferguson, and this said that separate but equal was legal. So with this, that meant you could have 2 different bathrooms, one for whites, one for coloreds. You could have different sinks. You could have different faucets. I mean, you could have restaurants that didn't serve Black people because there were supposedly restaurants that did serve Black people, and that would be separate but equal. We also have lots of Jim Crow laws, sharecropping and tenant farming, literacy tests and poll taxes. These were 2 things that were really used to keep African Americans from being able to vote. And we will see this will continue to be an issue until the 1960s when we start talking about civil rights. And then lynching was a major issue again, especially in the South. So we have some important acts that were part of this time period. The Indian Removal Act moved Indians from a certain area. It's pretty self-explanatory there. The Dawes Act of 1887 said that tribes no longer owned land, and it really tried to make them individual citizens. But if you know anything about the Indian tribes, they function as a group. They do their best work when they function as a group. So by removing land from the tribe and giving it to individual people, it actually became very unproductive. Plus, you have to think too, they probably weren't given the best land to begin with. They were usually given the land that no one else wanted. Think of like side of mountains, swamplands. So it makes sense that they were not able to make crops or grow crops in these areas because obviously if it was good land, the white people that were moving into the area would have taken it. And then the Homestead Act, which is why the Indian Removal Act and the Dawes Act really were a big thing, was it provided homesteads or tracts of land, so 160 acres of land for a small fee for anyone who agreed to work the land and live on it for 5 years. This is a huge deal, and this is really when we start to see people moving out west because city life at this time is not great. And so they were like, you know what? We're going to take our chances and move out west and try living on a homestead and growing everything and having a farm and all that jazz. And so the Homestead Act was huge. Also, since we're local, OU, I mean, their chant is boomer sooner, right? So boomers were the ones that went when they were allowed to go, and Sooners are actually the ones that went early and pre-picked their plots of land and claimed them before you were supposed to go. So that's kind of where the history of that term comes from, is actually from this Homestead Act. So now you know, fun stuff, right? We also have the Interstate Commerce Act. This ruled that only Congress had the power to regulate interstate commerce. At this time, interstate commerce is really trains, right? We don't have cars. I mean, yes, buggies and horses are great, but when you're trying to move a lot of product, you want to use the railroads. So the Interstate Commerce Act said that the railroads had to charge fairer prices, and this was good for commerce or business, for everyone, because if you were living out west, you depended on the railroads to get what you needed. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act, this was the first federal law to restrict immigration to the U.S., and it banned the immigration of Chinese workers and residents for employment purposes. So when you think of where the Asian immigrants come in from, most of them were coming in through California, specifically San Francisco through Angel Island. This is a very big deal, and most of the Chinese people that were coming into the United States from there were actually working on the railroads, and they were seen as a very cheap source of labor. And so they were used as a cheap source of labor. And then people start moving out west, and they're like, wait, white people should have these jobs. And that's where the Chinese Exclusion Act comes from. As you know, we still have issues with immigration today, but 1882 is the first federal law to restrict immigration in the United States. Okay, third parties. We will talk about third parties all, like the entire course. So it's important that you kind of understand what a third party is. So a third party is any party that is not Republican or Democrat. Makes sense, right? So you've got your model here. Okay, so Republican, Democrat. It's usually not split 50-50. I kind of just did that to show you what it looks like. But then when you have a third party does not divide it equally into thirds. That would be way too simple. What happens is a third party usually branches from one of the main parties. So the first one that we're going to be talking about will actually look like this. It's an offshoot of the Republican Party, and what happens is it splits the Republican voters. Half of the voters will vote through the Republican Party, half of them will vote through the third party, which leaves, obviously, the Democrat over here will win, because as you can see, they are getting their full slice of the pie. These don't come out into perfect quarters, and this is not a perfect half. Things definitely change, and a third party can get more votes than the major party that they're part of, but that's very rare. In modern times, a third party has never won, but we see third parties as very efficient as getting things discussed that maybe the Republican or Democrat Party don't want discussed in DC. So they are good at getting bills passed and acts enacted and all of those kind of things, because they bring up topics that then the Republican and Democrat parties have to take a stance on, where previously they might not have made a stance on something because of this. So that is what a third party is. And it can happen for either side. So you can have a Democratic Party that's split, and you've got a third party and then the Democrats, and this would be all Republicans. And in that case, you would expect the Republicans to win. A third party can be on either side, but like I said, this one is just showing what the first one we'll discuss will be. So here's some amendments that actually became a thing because of third parties. So we've got the 16th Amendment, which created the graduated income tax. So this means depending on how much money you make is how much income tax you pay. We still have this today. You can look it up, and depending on how much your annual income is a percentage that you have to pay in income tax a year. And then the 17th Amendment is direct election of senators. So previously, senators would be appointed by their buddies, but this kind of led to a lot of corruption, as you can imagine. So nowadays, we actually vote for our senators directly. When you turn 18, you can vote. And it's very important that you do so, because you have a responsibility to make sure you're putting good people in office to do good things. So direct election of senators means that the people now get the chance to elect senators, instead of them just being put into places of power by their friends. Okay, the Gilded Age was also known as a time of invention and entrepreneurship. So here we have Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone. My, how things have changed, right? You probably know who this. It's Orville and Wilbur Wright on Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, with their glider. The sewing machine was made in the 1950s. Before this, everything was sewn by hand. Elevators. Elevators are actually a lot older than you would think they'd be, because the first elevator was created by Otis, or first passenger elevator, and that was in 1925. I'm going to skip this one for now. I'll come back. But the Edison with the light bulb, 1925. Edison was a voracious inventor. He invented lots of things. The light bulb is what he is credited for most often, but you can actually look and see all of the patents that he held, and there are many things that he created during his life just because he loved seeing how things work and seeing how he could make things better. And then down here we have the typewriter, almost 100 years before the elevator. So quite a gap there. But the Bessemer process is really one that's going to change a lot of things in society. This is a way to refine steel so that it is better and easier to use than any other processes. Plus, it's cheaper. So you will have the Bessemer process that's being used to create trains and to create anything that's really made out of steel. And it's a very big deal because before, steel was extremely expensive. With the Bessemer process, you could create and refine steel and make it stronger, better, all that jazz, and it wasn't that expensive. So by decreasing the price, the demand increased and people were able to use it a lot more frequently. Okay, so why is it called the Gilded Age? Like I said, right after the Civil War, it's a time known as Reconstruction as society is rebuilding and navigating through the new laws that were put in place. And then we get into the Gilded Age, which is known for political corruption and industrial growth. So the Gilded Age has an interesting story. And really, to understand, you have to know what gilded means. So think of society as a penny, okay? Like you found a penny on the ground. It's kind of dirty and gross. This is society with political corruption, okay? If it was a new penny, it would be nice and clean. That would be no political corruption. But your penny is gross and dirty, and that is the political corruption that's gotten onto the penny, okay? Now we're going to take that penny and dip it in gold, which is called gilding something. So have you ever seen something that's gilt or gilded? It actually just means it's coated in a, usually gold, but it's coated in a precious metal. So it can be used any precious metal, but it's usually gold. Like if you go see old buildings, like especially in Europe, they usually have a lot of gilt pieces because that's kind of how you show your wealth. So now we have a penny that's been dipped in gold, and the gold here represents the industrial growth. When you look at the penny, you see the beautiful shiny gold. And so on the outside, a lot of people think of the US during this time as a great time because we were growing in what we were able to make, what we were able to sell, how much money was in the economy. But there was so much political corruption that the money was not spread around in a way that really made sense. So if you took your penny and you kind of scratched at the surface, you would see that the gold would come off and you would still just had a dirty penny. So hopefully that metaphor makes sense, because that's what the Gilded Age was. It looked shiny and good on the outside, but on the inside, it was really, it was dirty and gross because of the political corruption. Okay, some of the problems with the Second Industrial Revolution was that robber barons tried to monopolize specific industries, an overall increase in air pollution and urbanization, and an increase in immigration in search for new jobs and opportunities. All of these things by themselves would be issues, but when you throw them all together, it is one huge societal issue. And I will show you first the robber barons that we are talking about. So this is really when we see entrepreneurship grow like never before. So this first person we're going to talk about is John D. Rockefeller, and he was the one who really monopolized the oil production and sale in the United States through his company Standard Oil. I mean, his legacy lives on in that of Rockefeller Plaza in New York. That statue in the front that you see right here, this is actually a gilded statue, right? It's not solid gold, but it is covered in gold. So another example of gild. So our next person is J.P. Morgan. You've probably heard that name before. His company is still around, and he was huge in the financial industry. Okay, next we have Andrew Carnegie. And Carnegie was big with steel. Of course, the Bessemer process made steel cheap to make, but he could sell it at a good price and made lots of money. So you've got Carnegie Hall here, as well as Carnegie Mellon University are both named after him. What's interesting about Andrew Carnegie is that he's actually, of these four men, he was the one who donated the most of his wealth. He was really the first philanthropist of his time, and he gave away millions of dollars. And when you think of millions, I mean, I can't even fathom what that would be today because of the change in currency value. But he gave away a lot of money to build libraries, to help education. He was really for the benefit of the group or the benefit of the public. And so he donated a lot of his money to those causes. And then last here we have Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt really, I think it was steel and lumber, as well as the railroad industry is what he was monopolizing. And of course, Vanderbilt University is what you might associate his name with. But he actually has a relative that's still living today, and you might know who it is. It's Anderson Cooper. So if you know who Anderson Cooper is from the line of Vanderbilts. Okay, immigration and urbanization. So urbanization is the growth of cities. So think of like country to city, farm to factory. It's people moving into an urban area. We had an issue with some nativism. So think of all of these people from very different backgrounds moving into one small area. Nativism was the policy of protecting the interests of native-born or established inhabitants against those of immigrants. Oh, the irony, because the United States is literally a country of immigrants. But here, it was the people who had been there the longest that had seen themselves as natives, and they were very harsh against those that were newly immigrating into this country. Think of the Irish. Okay, so the Irish were moving here during the potato famine, so we have a huge influx of the Irish, but then also the Italian. Both of those nationalities were really despised and were not treated well during this time because of the nativism that was happening. We have push and pull factors. So a pull factor is what causes an individual to come to a new country, while a push factor is what causes an individual to leave their home country. You can have one without the other, but they usually go hand in hand. So if you are leaving a country, think of like war, famine, all those kind of things. Those would be push factors, okay? But a pull factor would be something that is unique and would bring you to that country. So like the American dream, you have a job lined up. All of these kind of things would be pull factors to have someone move to the United States. Or education. Think of like coming here to have education like a university. People do that as well. So those are push and pull factors. Some of the problems was that there was inadequate public services and transportation were issues. So when I say public services, one of the biggest ones that you will see is actually the sanitation problems. There really wasn't widespread plumbing, if at all, but also trash. So during this time, to live in a city, you lived where trash was just lining everywhere. And that was how it is. So just think how many people got sick because of their surroundings during this time. But then also urban pollution was an issue because, urban and air pollution were an issue because of all the factories that were in cities, and they were burning coal to run the factories, and then you just had no requirements of what they could and couldn't do. And so air pollution just kind of took over. The shifting patterns of immigration increased with nativism, Americanism, and racial tensions. Like I said, you have a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds that are coming to live in one area. This causes issues. We start to see too that people move into areas that are more populated with people like them. So like if you went to New York City, or really any major city, you can go to Chinatown, or you can go to Little Italy, or all of these areas. They're named that because those are where people moved in during these times because they wanted to live by people that were like them. Make sense? Excellent. Okay, life of the poor. It was not great for those in poverty in the late 1800s. They usually had very crowded living conditions. They worked long hours, and again, poor sanitation. So unless you had money, you most likely lived in a rundown apartment building called tenements. They were 4 to 6 stories, and that room, they maybe had a couple of rooms on each floor, but 4 families would live on each floor. So these would just be packed with people. Also, there was maybe 1 bathroom per floor. So just think of that. You either had to share the bathroom with 4 other families or with the entire building, because there just wasn't a lot that was offered with these tenements. But at that time, you couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Plus think too, family sizes in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s were much larger than they are today. So when I say family of, or 4 families, don't think it's like 2 people per family or 3 or 4. Think of like 8, 9 people in a family, because you had a lot of children, hoping that some of them would make it to adulthood. So keep that in mind too. They were packed in there very closely, like sardines. If one got a cold, they all got a cold. It was dangerous. Jobs were also dangerous, and workers worked long hours, made very low wages, and had unsafe working conditions. And so this led to the growth of labor unions. So labor leaders battled with company owners and managers to really change things in the organization to benefit the workers. They wanted to increase wages, change the unsafe working conditions for their employees, and not require them to work as many hours. Many factory laborers formed and joined unions in order to take part in collective bargaining with employers. So collective bargaining is when a group of people work together to have a larger voice. So like, I love this political cartoon here because you can see it's a huge group of people, but if just one person was raising their hand, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But since they're all together and they're all working together for the same cause, they have a much larger impact together than they would separately. So think of that with collective bargaining here, and then also with labor unions. So some patriotic organizations push for Americanization of immigrants, which would mean that they would actually have to learn about American values, history, and citizenship. So the Americanization requirements kind of depended on where you lived, but it could be rather strenuous, and you would actually have to go to class to learn about US history, or you'd have to take English classes, or really anything that they wanted to throw at you. But the idea was they were going to make you an American. Jane Addams founded Hull House, led many educated young women on a mission to help the poor, and later to press for women's suffrage. And Hull House was one of the first settlement houses during this time. We'll talk about settlement houses more in the next unit, but with settlement houses, it was free for the people living there. They usually provided some sort of education. So if you wanted to learn about the history of the United States, or if you wanted to learn English, or you needed job training, it was done on site. And they usually fed you, and there was usually a daycare on site. So if you had to work all day, you actually had somewhere that would watch your child while you were working. So if you had a choice, the settlement houses were the much better choice. However, settlement houses were rather picky with who they let live there. It was usually single mothers, not whole families. So just keep that in mind. Not everyone had the opportunity to live in a settlement house. Many middle-class women joined Protestant churches to apply Christian principles to address the problems of poverty, and churches offered counseling, job training, libraries, and other social services. So this is the social gospel movement. This is using Christian principles to change society. That's what their idea was. We'll talk more about the social gospel movement in the next video, because that is really when we start to see what all is happening there. But by 1900, most states had passed compulsory education laws, which required parents to send children to school. And by 1900, 72% of children were in school. Before we continue, why were most children not going to school? If you think about it, it might come right to you, it might not, but most children of this time were actually working in factories. They were a source of income. So they didn't go to school because they needed to work to help their families. So by 1900, with 72% of American children in school, that was a huge increase from what they had without the compulsory education laws. So a more educated public created a demand for books and newspapers written for the average American. There was a huge increase in literature that was made during this time, but then also newspapers were everything. Everyone read the newspaper, and you really had to be literate, so you had to be able to read the newspaper. But in case you didn't know, newspapers are written to the level that I believe a third grader can read, if not a sixth grader nowadays. But back then, I'm thinking it was a little lower. So the idea was that everyone had access to the news, and they just got their news a different way than we did. Like nowadays, you would like watch the news on TV, or you would scroll through Twitter and kind of see what's going on, or I mean, even going to Yahoo and looking at the homepage and seeing all the stories. Back then, they would use newspapers, and that's how you found out information. So that is all for the Gilded Age. I will post this and share with you all, as well as including some videos that might be helpful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, It's cassidy.regal@allenisd.org. And we can chat through email, or we can set up a time to chat on Zoom, or you can come to my scheduled Zoom meetings or scheduled Zoom tutorial times Monday through Thursday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. If you have any questions, I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day.